Let's talk now about labor actions, that is, great strikes. In the battle that developed between labor and capital during this age of industrialization, particularly on this kind of scale, is very difficult for a society to accommodate. It causes all kinds of changes. Again, it's a heroic age in which none of the rules are set up. And so tempers flare, people over respond, and it takes a while to work out mechanisms by which peaceful change can occur at the margins. And that, in and of itself, that whole concept of peaceful changing occurring at the margins is a 20th century American as well as Western European concept. It did not pertain in the late 19th century. Also, we find that as employers are trying to squeeze as much money as they possibly can, particularly large industrialists are trying to squeeze as much money as they can into profit. That frequently means squeezing it from workers as well, refusing to allow workers to organize and actively suppressing such organization. Workers, for their part, tend to be in this era immigrants, whether they're immigrants from farms or immigrants from foreign countries matters not. There's also a significant change in the, you might say, hopes and dreams concept, that instead of developing an independent, quote unquote, competence by having a set of skills, all that a laborer has in a factory, manufacturing, railroad, or even factory farming situation is his or her sweat and strength to sell. And once that sweat and strength is not sufficient to do the job, then they are cast aside. Or if they're injured, they're cast aside. This is going to lead to great amounts of antagonism and violence. And some of this is violence on the part of workers, and some of it is violence on the part of employers. And frequently, it's just an overall violent culture without very many rules about how to solve the problems that come about because of rapid and significant industrialization and the creation of the nation state. As Terence Powderly and his Knights of Labor ask themselves, what is the state and what is American society going to look like? And will it benefit us? And that's the thing that owners and managers asked as well. Nevertheless, some of the problems that had to be gotten beyond, he says in passive voice, led to great battles between labor and capital. And let's look at 4 of these right now. These are emblematic. These are not the only strikes that occurred, but they tend to be some of the major touchstones of this era. And again, they are all symbolic or representative of how this strike era played out. The first we want to look at, and we want to look at these in order. The first one is a chronological order. The first one is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is the first U.S. nationwide strike by workers. It's the first interstate strike in U.S. history. The original cause of it was wage cuts during the lingering depression of the 1870s by the B&O rail line in Maryland. It began as a spontaneous strike in Martinsburg, West Virginia on July 17, 1877. July 7th, 1877. It began with wildcat walkouts all along the B&O, which the West Virginia line was part of. It spread to the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then it spread to lines outside of the Northeast, into the Midwest, and into the South. In many cases, as the strike spread, local ad hoc councils of the rail union tried to coordinate with one another using telegraph lines. And they did so well enough that they could consider this to be a nationwide strike that was operating not necessarily with a single leadership, but at least with a coordinated effort. In many of these local union committees, then the socialists were the most organized group. They were kind of the left wing of the labor movement, and they were to use a communist phrase, the cadres of leadership. They were the most actively involved in the unions, and they frequently held positions of leadership. And so this suddenly took on in the national press and among anti-socialists a very much socialist tinge. And so they could the strike could be called a socialist strike by people who wanted to paint it with a brush that didn't really apply, but it's understandable how they could come to see it as a socialist strike. Now, remember, one of the things that was so frightening about the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was that the socialist leadership looked back to the last big socialist-led revolution in Europe, which was the Paris Commune of 1871 that ended violently and disastrously, but heroically. And so many of the members of leadership of this railroad strike of 1877 looked back to the Paris Commune. And indeed, in St. Louis, the strike committee took over the government of the city, the municipal government, and called itself the Commune, which just fed the propaganda machine of the anti-socialists. Now, there's no downside to feeding a propaganda machine, except when that propaganda machine has access to the coercive machinery of the state, and the owners did. And after Pittsburgh erupted in riots and Baltimore erupted in riots on July 20th, which led to a number of killings, a number of deaths, and the burning of the roundhouses in both Pittsburgh and Baltimore, then the federal government got directly involved using troops that had just been released from duty in the South to move into the strike zones and reestablish order at the point of bayonet. So the strike was put down in a bloody wave of repression, and completely failed by the beginning of fall of 1877. That is, the workers went back to work. Those that weren't completely released from employment and blackballed went back to work for whatever the bosses were willing to pay. This was just a paroxysm of violence then, but again, it was the first great nationwide strike. Now, strikes continued through 1877, 1878, 1879, on into the 1880s, though they weren't quite as violent after 1880 because the economy improved pretty substantially, at least for the industrial sector in the 1880s. So other things became important. And by 1886, the Knights of Labor had really established themselves as the front for the 8-hour day. And at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago in May of 1886, the Knights led an 8-hour day wildcat strike and protest at which a number of workers were killed. That would be May 1st, 1886. In fact, the so-called Socialist International Labor Day, which is usually held on May 1st, is directly connected. The date of May 1st comes from the killing of these strikers on May 1st, 1886. Well, that's not the Haymarket Affair, but that's what led to the Haymarket Affair, which was an anarchist-led protest rally that occurred in the so-called Haymarket, a square, you know, like Times Square in New York, like Union Square in New York. The Haymarket was an open plaza fed by 5 or 6 streets that was good for, between buildings, that was a good place to hold a rally. And 8 anarchists were speaking at this rally on May 4th in kind of a desultory rain. It was cold, as it often is in May in Chicago. And the last of these anarchist speakers calling for solidarity and continued striking and all of this, when the last of these speakers was finishing up and the crowd was just about to start moving out, the police surrounded the crowd, and someone threw a bomb, like a hand grenade, that exploded and injured and killed a couple of policemen, and guns started blazing. Sometimes it was the police, sometimes it was the strikers. Frequently, no one knows where the bullets were coming from. Everybody was running like mad, and at least one more policeman was killed. This seems to have been a police riot. It's not even, there's a lot of discussion still about whether or not an agent provocateur threw the bomb or if the police themselves threw the bomb. It's pretty much agreed upon by historians that the anarchists had nothing to do with the bomb, with the possible exception of one named Louis Ling. So it's still kind of up in the air, but the police responded by drawing their guns and firing into the crowd. The crowd fired back. People got killed. We don't know how many of the protesters were killed or injured, but we do know that a couple of the policemen were killed and a number of them were injured. The anarchists were all arrested. They were put on trial for murder, and they were sentenced to either long terms in prison or to be executed for the murder of at least one of the policemen. This led to anti-red hysteria, red being not the color of the Republican Party, but the color of revolution and the banner color of socialism during this period. And so there was an anti-red reaction. This was seen as a horror, and many people said that they would be happy just to get rid of all anarchists. 4 of these anarchists, 4 of the 8 anarchists from Haymarket were ultimately executed. One committed suicide. Louis Ling committed suicide by biting a blasting cap that had been slipped to him in a kiss given to him by his girlfriend. And eventually the other 3 were pardoned by Governor John Altgeld in 1893, I believe. This hysteria in the immediate aftermath of Haymarket led to a wrecking of the radical left. Many anarchist organizations and presses were attacked. Some by vigilantes, some by policemen, some by National Guardsmen or militiamen, as they were called then. Labor groups were disrupted, and in fact, the Knights of Labor were ultimately tainted with the Haymarket explosion, and it led to the demise of the Knights of Labor. The complete wrecking of the Knights of Labor, which held on until about 1900, but really was kaput with the resignation and retirement of Terence Powderly in 1890. Again, strikes occurred every year. They occurred all over the place. But our next big emblematic strike is the Homestead Strike of 1892. This occurred in the steel industry. This occurred in the company town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, just outside of the Homestead steelworks of Andrew Carnegie. Homestead was a Carnegie Steel Company town. That is, it was owned and operated a living space with stores and other facilities owned by the company. The Homestead Strike wasn't really a strike; it was a lockout. The union had negotiated a contract. It was coming up for renewal. Henry Clay Frick, who was Carnegie's ruthless manager of Homestead, decided he was going to break the steelworkers union so he can negotiate wages with individual crews and individual members and get a better price for his labor. So he offered them a drop-dead contract. That is a final offer contract, which he knew they would not accept. So he locked them out on June 29th, 1892, and built a fence around the Homestead Steel mill itself. Now, the mill was on the Monongahela River, and the mill Frick and Carnegie wanted to get the mill running again, so they needed to bring in alternative workers. These workers are usually known as strike breakers, and in union parlance, they're called scabs. Well, there was no real entry into the plant because the strikers, the locked out workers, had surrounded the plant on three sides. No one could get past them. And they were armed, so no one was going to try. But the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which during this period after the Civil War morphed from being an investigative agency to being a strike-breaking organization as one of its main revenue streams, instead of spying, it spied on and provoked labor organizations, and then did things to try to disrupt and destroy labor organizations, including what they did at the Homestead Strike, which was to try to secretly bring in about 300 strike breakers on boats up the river on July 6th. They left port slightly upriver from Homestead on about midnight on June 5th and 6th, but the strikers knew that they were coming. They had their own spies. They knew that the Pinkertons were escorting barges full of potential workers that were going to enter the plant from the unguarded riverside, and so they lined the banks of the river. And when the barges came into range, they opened fire with rifles, pistols, and a cannon onto these barges. Well, they didn't do a huge amount of damage because the barges were built in such a way to withstand that kind of assault, except for the cannon, which was a surprise. But the towboat turned tail and ran, and just left these barges slowly coasting down this gauntlet of withering fire. This is called the Battle of Monongahela of July 6th. Eventually, the attack was so severe that the Pinkertons and the strikebreakers surrendered. They were turned loose, told to never come back again. Eventually, they were able to get inside of the plant, which, because of the wall, had been dubbed Fort Frick. by November, the strike was broken. People got to eat. They can't be out of work forever. And Frick held out, even though at one point in the strike on July 23rd, an anarchist named Alexander Berkman, a skinny kid who was physically unable to do what he wanted to do, attempted to assassinate Frick by going into Frick's office on a Saturday afternoon, pulling a pistol and shakily trying to fire the pistol. It misfired. So as Frick, who was a big, powerful man, jumped up from his desk to attack Berkman, Berkman pulled a knife and stabbed Frick in the neck with it. This, of course, is attempted murder. Well, Frick was unsuccessful, did not kill, Berkman did not kill Frick. And in fact, Frick, after the attack, went home, rested for a day, bandaged his wounds, and was back at work on Monday morning. Alexander Berkman was on his way to a 14-year prison sentence, after which he got out and he went back to his previous life as the boyfriend of that other well-known anarchist, Emma Goldman, who we'll talk about a little bit during Unit 2. So the Homestead Strike failed. And 2 years later, after the beginning of the Panic of 1893, then we see the last of these enormous strikes in the Pullman Strike. Now, the Pullman Strike is also a nationwide strike. And it's interesting to note in the Pullman Strike that the real center of the problem wasn't Pullman and the Pullman Company. That there was a strike at the Pullman Company, but all of the action was taking place because of a sympathetic strike that the American Railway Union called to support the Pullman workers. So let's talk about how the Pullman Strike emerged. Pullman, Illinois was the company town of the Pullman Palace Car Company. The Palace cars were great sleeper cars that there were a couple of different iterations. One was a multi-use sleeper. One was the current type of sleeper that we had today, and the other was a palace car, quite literally, that the well-to-do would own and would have hooked up to trains that they wanted to travel on. So it would be a private car. So Pullman invented his sleeper car, which made transcontinental and long-distance travel very much more comfortable than it had been. It made it desirable. You could actually go on a long train trip to get to wherever you wanted to go because you could go to sleep lying down on a Pullman car. So these things were very popular, and Pullman had gotten rich by making these cars, and more people wanted to have access to Pullman cars, and so trains that got bigger and longer and carried more people then carried more Pullman cars. The Pullman Company had this town in which they rented houses to workers who worked for them, and in 1894, the Pullman Company decided that it would cut wages, but it did not cut rents. And so workers struck the Pullman Company. They called on other unions, particularly the American Railway Union, the ARU, to strike with them. And by May 11th, 1894, 50,000 of the ARU affiliated workers refused in a sympathy strike to handle to handle trains that had Pullman cars attached to them. If the Pullman cars didn't run, then Pullman would be put under a lot of pressure to deal with the workers, which the Pullman people were refusing to do. On July 2nd, the Pullman Company secured from a willing federal judge an injunction against the sympathy strike under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and 2 days later, against the wishes of the governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, President Cleveland marshaled troops and sent them into Pullman to both put down that strike and into Chicago to get the Chicago rail yards handling cars again. Now, how did they do this? They attached the railroads attached mail cars or designated one of the Pullman cars as a mail car. So the federal government had an interest in the strike because the mails were not moving. This is relatively convoluted and sounds like a technicality, and indeed that's how a lot of this legal stuff that goes along with these strikes operated. But nevertheless, an injunction is an injunction. The American Railway Union leader, Eugene Debs, refused to handle or to deal with the injunction. He refused to give up because of the injunction. He kept the ARU strike going regardless of what happened in Pullman. So he was arrested and imprisoned, convicted and imprisoned for failure to heed the injunction and for contempt of court. He was sentenced to 6 months. And during that period of time, he read a great deal and was convinced to become a socialist. Now, the point here is the strike itself and how the strike spread and how the strike operated, but also it's to bring Eugene Debs into the picture. Debs was a labor leader from Terre Haute, Indiana, American born and bred, and he had a very peculiarly American strand of populism, socialism. He became the standard bearer for the American Socialist Party and ran as its candidate multiple times, doing his best in the very important presidential election of 1912, in which he garnered about 1 million votes, and his coattails dragged in a bunch of municipal councilmen, a couple of congressmen with him as socialist candidates, successful socialist office holders. Anyway, this is where Debs got his start. And this ends our discussion of the battles between labor and management and capital in the Gilded Age. Again, thank you very much.